Good morning, folks. We are about to get started. Just as a quick reminder, I'm putting the link to the handout in the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. I'd also like to remind you that if you are doing this for continuing education credit, there will be 4 attendance polls that you will have to respond to. You'll need to respond to at least 3 out of those 4 in order to get the CE credit. It's a simple question. It just says, hey, are you still here? And you just answer yes. Theoretically, if you answered no, that would be fine too, because it shows that you're still here. But you will need to respond within about 60 to 90 seconds for that poll before it goes away. Once again, also, please remember that the Q&A feature is where you ask any questions for Anita. If you have any technical or non-Q&A issues, then use the chat section. But otherwise, please use only the Q&A if you have questions for Anita. Anita may not see questions in the chat function at all. All right, folks, it's 9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just real quick before we do, I want to show you what that attendance poll will look like. Some people have been having some trouble, so I'm going to show you real quick a sample poll. You don't have to answer this one. It doesn't count towards the attendance, but this gives you an idea of the question that you'll have to answer if you want that CE. So it's real easy. Answer yes or no. Like I said, no actually counts as a proper response as well because it shows that you actually answered it. So there's no wrong answer. So this is the type of poll that you'll be doing. And then I'm just going to end it right now. We're going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, Anita York is our speaker today, our presenter rather. And Anita is a partner at the employment law firm of Scott & Whitehead. She litigates on issues in a variety of areas, including discrimination, harassment, retaliation, wrongful termination, and wage and hour claims. Her counseling practice includes advising employers on a broad range of employment-related matters, conducting management training programs, which she has also done for Phillips Accountancy, and seminars, and preparing employee handbooks, which once again, she has also done for Phillips Accountancy. There's really nobody else that we recommend in terms of employment law other than Anita York. If you come to us and say, hey, I've got a question, I've got this employee, I think they're embezzling, what should we do? We will refer you to Anita York. So save yourself the hassle and get her email address. I'll put that in the chat box below. But otherwise, Anita, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Welcome everybody to our third and final installment for our 2021 series. So as many of you know, in January, we covered what I call documentation, discipline, discharge, which is sort of cradle to grave, pre-employment, hiring, managing, end of employment issues and those kinds of things. Last month, we had a ton of fun with wage and hour, kind of probably scaring some of you a bit, but trying to help you to know what's required, what's not required, because I know that that's one of the things that we see most often with our dental practices when they get into trouble. It's because of wage and hour kinds of things. And March's program I call Hot Topics because it's sort of everything else. So January, February, we have themes, right? We sort of have the employment relationship in January, wage and hour in February, and then March is everything else that didn't fit into one of those 2 categories or that didn't fit into that 2-hour period. And so instead of sort of having one topic that we're just going to really dive into for a couple of hours, today's program is half a dozen topics that we're going to dive into for maybe 20 minutes each, some more than others, but that's kind of the concept. So that makes today's program a little bit more, I don't know, complicated in the sense that you kind of get your head into one topic and then just when you're sort of overwhelmed and spinning, but kind of have it and move you on to something else. So that's our plan for today. Good luck. Hope you stick with me. I picked topics that I think are relevant, I think are important. I will confess I am not going to talk about COVID, but at the end there will be a Q&A. I'll answer whatever I can for anybody, whether it's on COVID or anything else. But my last, for sure, 30 days, maybe 60 days, kind of since our big holiday surge calmed down. I've been, as many of you know, I've been so focused on COVID for the better part of the last year. Everything else came out of the woodwork, and I'm working day and night now doing everything but COVID. Doesn't mean I don't still do some COVID when it comes up. We're just not seeing too much of it. So hopefully COVID has calmed down for all of you too. You're getting back to normal life. So let's make sure that we give you some tips on what to do with all that. So as Andrew said, there will be, I think, 3 or 4 poll questions, and I think you have to answer 3 of them. That cracked me up, Andrew, that you can answer no, because it still means that you're here. I love that. The smart aleck in me would definitely be clicking no on every one of those. At different points where we're leaving major topics, I've got a slide in there to remind myself to look at questions. So we'll look and see if we have questions on topic at that point in time. But you can put questions into the Q&A anytime you want on any topic you want. Andrew's going to help me sort through those. And then again, at the very end, the program today is probably only about an hour and a half, and that was very intentional. So we have time for whatever Q&A we need at the end of the program. Not only is my email address in the chat section, but if you have the handout, it's on the front cover of the handout. I always invite you to email me if you have questions afterwards that I can help answer for you. We're going to start with CFRA, which is the California Family Rights Act. And we're starting here because this is going to be brand new for most of you. FMLA, you all have heard of, is the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, applies to employers with 50 or more employees. CFRA is the California version of that, used to apply to employers with 50 or more employees. So most of you didn't think about that. As of January 1st, it applies to employers with 5 or more employees. It's very important. I think I'm going to see a lot of claims on it in the coming year or two. And so I'm going to spend some time on that, hoping to help you understand what that is. Then we're going to expand the topic a little bit and talk about leaves of absence in general. This is an area that I see a lot of dental practices don't know, so they just sort of let it go. When people want to leave of absence, they just say yes. They let them take the time off, and they don't worry about like all of it until the employee's been gone for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Then they want to know what can they do. Well, at that point, their hands are a little bit tied if they didn't do some things that they should have done in the beginning. So we're going to talk about leaves of absence, give you some information on what applies to you, what doesn't apply to you. We're going to talk about, at the end of leaves of absence, we're going to move into what I call reasonable accommodation discussion, because a leave of absence is a form of reasonable accommodation in some contexts, but there are other reasonable accommodations and there are requirements on you to reasonably accommodate. So we're going to spend some time on that. We're going to spend a few minutes on mediation and arbitration. What is it? Why do you care? We're going to spend a few minutes on release agreements and severance pay. Should you pay it? Shouldn't you pay it? Why should you pay it? We'll spend a little bit of time on unemployment insurance, kind of helping you to understand here's how it works when somebody files an unemployment insurance application. Should you oppose it? Do you want to oppose it? Why should you oppose it? Will you win? What is the EDD looking for in their unemployment insurance applications? Then I'm going to spend just a moment talking about EPLI, Employment Practices Liability Insurance, to kind of talk a little bit about what it is and should you have it. And then, of course, we'll jump into the Q&A. All right, before we get started, I am going to use a lot of acronyms today, because if I said California Family Rights Act every single time I was talking about it, it would double the time of my program. So this is your cheat sheet. Use it now, use it later. CFRA refers to what the California Family Rights Act, which we'll be talking about first. FMLA is the federal version. We're not going to talk about that much at all. I'm throwing in FFCRA simply because I'm getting calls from dentists in the last several weeks where they're really confusing FFCRA, FMLA, CFRA. I feel like I'm in the military. My military friends are constantly using acronyms and I have no idea what they're talking about most of the time, but I'm going to throw some acronyms at you today. So the FFCRA, you may recall, is the family's first Coronavirus Response Act, which last year required that you pay employees for certain time off, gave you reimbursement. We're not talking about that today, again, unless somebody has a question in the Q&A that we'll deal with later. But I just want you to, like, when I say these things, you may confuse FFCRA with what I'm talking about. We're not talking about FFCRA today. We're talking about leaves of absence that fall under more permanent statutory schemes, namely CFRA and the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which I should have put on this cheat sheet, darn me. Okay, PDL refers to pregnancy disability leave, which we'll talk about. We get that from the PDA, which is not public display of affection. It is the Pregnancy Disability Act. SDI, California State Disability Insurance, is just a bucket of money. It's just money that an employee can get. It's actually not a defined leave of absence. PFL, California Paid Family Leave, again, another bucket of money. It's not actually a required leave of absence. PSL, I'm going to talk about a little bit, paid sick leave benefits when they come into play. And then throughout here, you'll see that I put in LOA just because it's an easier way to say leave of absence. I use it a lot, so I just thought I'd throw in and explain that. The new California Family Rights Act legal mandate means a lot of things to you guys. So again, as I mentioned, it's the California state counterpart to the FMLA. The CFRA and the FMLA used to be really, really, really similar. There was a couple of major differences, but other than that, they were very similar. Not only does CFRA now apply to employers with 5 or more employees, they've also made other changes. So now there's some very significant changes that make California even more special than we already were. So again, in particular, it applies to everybody with 5 or more employees. And when you're figuring out how many employees you have, everybody counts. So everybody who's on payroll, even if they only work for you 1 day a week, 1 day a month, they all count. If you have independent contractors who should be employees, they will count. So make sure that you're making a fair evaluation as to whether or not this applies to you. All right, what is CFRA? The CFRA basically is a statutory scheme that says if you qualify for CFRA leave, you get 12 weeks, up to 12 weeks of job protected time off. So employee goes out on their CFRA leave of absence, you get to hold their job. You can certainly bring in a temp, but you have to give them their job back when they come back to work. So there are basically 4 categories of reasons that an employee might be eligible for CFRA leave. The first is the employee's own serious health condition. We call that employee medical leave. Second one is employee needs to take care of a family member who has a serious health condition. We call that family caregiver leave. Baby bonding for a newborn child, child bonding for a child who's placed in your home, adoption, foster child, somebody that you newly have legal guardianship over. That applies within that child's first year of birth or first year within your home. And qualifying exigency leave, which I will tell you in all my years, I've never had anybody call me because somebody's taking this, but basically if your employee has a family member who is on military duty, and because of that military duty, that employee has to take some time off for certain reasons, that is now protected in California. 5 or more employees under CFRA. We'll talk more about each of these as we go through. So who is an eligible employee? An eligible employee is someone who's been with you for at least a year and who worked at least 1,250 hours during that prior 12 months. Now, the math on this means that that person's working an average of 24, 25 hours per week. So if you have somebody, for example, who works for you 3 days a week, there's a good chance that they will never qualify. Because even though they work for you 3 days a week, and that's probably 24 hours, they probably take some time off, and you've got some holidays that you're closed for, and they're going to have some, days that they call out sick or things like that. So employee who works for you on average about 3 days a week may not hit that 1250 hours, may not qualify for CFRA leave. You will determine that probably by contacting your payroll service at the time that somebody says they need a leave of absence and say, I need to know in the last 12 months starting today, how many hours did Susie work? Hopefully your payroll service can help you to figure that out. And of course, the third factor is they qualify under one of the permissible CFRA reasons. All right, so let's talk about the first reason, employee job protected medical leave. This is if an employee needs to be out based on medical certification. You can require medical certification. You should require medical certification. You're probably going to hear me say this about 6 times, if not more, because I want this to really stick like cement in your brain. Don't just give somebody a medical leave of absence without requiring medical certification. That's when you get yourself into the situation where you don't know if they need to be off work anymore or they just want to be off work. You need to have that medical certification. So they're on a medical leave of absence for up to 12 weeks. If at some point they're released to return to work with restrictions, and you cannot accommodate those restrictions, we're going to talk more about that a little bit later, then that means that person is continuing to be on CFRA medical leave. It includes what we call intermittent leave. So an employee may need time off that is not a consecutive period of time. I may not need 6 weeks off, but I'm going to be getting medical treatment that is going to be every Thursday for the next 6 weeks. Therefore, I need every Thursday off work. And after my medical treatment, I'm not going to be feeling well, so I'm going to need Friday off also. Your response, okay, I'm going to need medical certification, a doctor's note on that, or a doctor's note, or what I call a healthcare provider certification form, which gives you a lot more information than that doctor's note gives you. If at some point you need that form, you can email me and just tell me healthcare provider certification. So you get that. You then determine, can you reasonably accommodate that intermittent leave? If that employee qualifies for CFRA, you probably have to accommodate that intermittent leave one way or another. CFRA leave also includes workers' comp, right? Because an employee who's off work on workers' comp is off work on a medical leave of absence. Of course, the difference here is they're off work on a medical leave because of a job-related injury or illness, or they're off work on a not job-related injury or illness. We'll talk more about those two and what rules apply to each later. But the bottom line is they both qualify for CFRA. So what I want you to make sure that you're doing when somebody is going out on a CFRA qualified medical leave is give them notice. You requested a leave of absence that qualifies under CFRA. You have up to 12 weeks based on medical certification. And then whatever other rules are going to apply. If you have medical insurance and they need to keep paying their own premiums, if the note only gave them 4 weeks, we talk about in the letter sort of, you're expected back on this date. If you need an extension, you must request it ahead of time. So for all of these kinds of leaves, particularly CFRA leaves, I want you documenting. Part of that documentation process is written notification from the employee with regard to a doctor's note or medical certification, documentation from you to the employee, your request for this leave is approved. Here's all the things that are going to apply to that leave of absence. All right, other medical notes. A CFRA leave of absence, of course, is unpaid. Almost every leave of absence we're going to talk about today is unpaid, except for one, and that's what we call donor leave. We'll talk about that about an hour from now, probably. So it's unpaid, but the employee is eligible for SDI, state disability insurance benefits, after a 1-week waiting period. You are required to give them information about SDI once you know that they need to be off work. So you can download that. You can ask me for it. You can also call, don't try calling EDD for anything if you don't have to, but you can go online and order copies of the SDI brochure. They're free. Now, the employee may also use their paid sick leave benefits, but as you may recall from last month, an employee really has the option whether to use their paid sick leave benefits or take that as unpaid time off, except in the context of most of these leaves of absence, not all, but most, you're actually allowed to require them to use any available vacation benefits. That's one of those many, many, many areas of the law that are completely inconsistent, and the legislature didn't think about the practicality of it. But believe it or not, you cannot require them to use their paid sick leave. You can require them to use their paid vacation leave benefits. All right, during a CFRA leave, group health insurance continues, meaning you must continue to pay your portion, but you can require that the employee continue to pay their portion. Again, that's one of those reasons that we give them that letter right at the very beginning that spells out. Normally, your health insurance premiums are paid through payroll deductions, but because you're not on payroll, there will be no deductions. Your share of the premiums is $125 a month. So you need to send us or provide to us payment each month that you are out for your share of the health insurance premiums in order to continue your insurance. All right. When CFRA leave expires, 12 weeks is up, right? Unfortunately, that is not the magic trigger for now you don't have to hold the job open. Under CFRA, guaranteed job protection for 12 weeks, there is no reasonable accommodation analysis. Once that 12 weeks expires, now they're on what we call a Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA, leave of absence. And now you can look at reasonable accommodation, undue hardship, those kinds of things. You're probably still going to have to provide time off, but you're no longer within that CFRA block of time. Now you're into a little bit more lenient block of time. Again, at this point, I want you sending out a written notice. Your CFRA leave has expired. You're now under a regular employee medical leave of absence. This is what we can do to reasonably accommodate you. We may not be able to hold your job indefinitely. Again, we're going to talk about documentation at that point in time, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And hopefully, if you've got an employee who's sort of lollygagging at home because they just don't want to come back to work, you can get them to make a decision. You're either coming back or you don't have a job anymore if it's no longer medically required that they be out. All right, now, of course, other than a CFRA leave, they're guaranteed time off for a workers' comp leave once that CFRA leave expires. All right, when is CFRA leave required? For family caregiver leave. So it's very similar in a lot of ways to the employee's own medical leave, except that they're taking care of another family member who has a serious health condition. And you can require family caregiver leave medical certification, meaning the family member's healthcare provider has to provide the certification that not only says there's a serious health condition, but it also says that you are required to be present off work in order to care for that individual. So that may be for a week because their child is having surgery and they have to keep the child home. It may be for 12 weeks because the spouse is undergoing some very, very serious treatment and must have 24-hour care. So there's different reasons that might apply. Under this category, the family members who qualify are the employee's spouse or registered domestic partner, the employee's parent, child, siblings, grandparents, grandchildren. With respect to parent and child, you've got step parents, you've got foster parents, you've got foster children, you've got stepchildren. It does sort of broaden the categories, particularly for child. For child, it's any child for whom that employee is like a parent. Again, it includes intermittent leave, so I need to be off every Monday and Tuesday because my partner is going to have a treatment on Monday, every Monday, and I need to be there to care for that person on Mondays and Tuesdays. Again, unpaid. Remember, medical leave, I said they may qualify for SDI. For caregiver leave, they probably qualify for PFL, paid family leave. Again, it's just a bucket of benefits that they get from EDD. Paid family leave is available for up to 8 weeks. Again, they may choose to use their paid sick leave because one of the paid sick leave purposes that is permitted is caring for somebody else who's sick or injured. And again, you may require that they use their accrued vacation benefits for family caregiver leave if you want to do that. One of the reasons that we sometimes want to do that is because an employee who's been out for some number of weeks for one of these kinds of leaves of absence then comes back and they still have 2 weeks of paid vacation benefits and they want to take their vacation. You also may want to, particularly if it's an employee who you really, they've been there a long time, they're a great employee, you want to do everything you can to support them. You may want to not require it. You certainly don't have to require that they use their vacation benefits, but be careful if you're treating people differently, that you have a good reason for doing so. All right, the third type, oh, my stomach is growling. I didn't eat breakfast this morning. The third type of CFRA leave is baby or child bonding leave. So if you have an employee who's pregnant, has their baby, we're going to talk about pregnancy disability leave in just a minute. Their pregnancy disability leave has ended in the sense that the doctor has released her to return to work. Now, in addition to that time, CFRA baby bonding begins, if she so chooses, and she now has an additional 12 weeks job protected time off for baby bonding, which means that an individual who was pregnant and had a baby potentially has up to almost 7 months of job protected time off if you are an employer with 5 or more employees. Believe me, I hear all of you. It is so crazy that if you only have 5 employees, you can be required to hold a job open for 7 months. I understand that if you have 50 or more employees, you should. Maybe even if you have 25 or more employees. But 5 employees, you're supposed to do without 20% of your workforce for up to 7 months. It is craziness. It is lunacy. As I oftentimes say on my little soapbox, it's as though the legislators never lived in the real world, never had a job, never had a company, were never managers, never had to deal with the difficulties of managing all this nonsense. But there you have it. It is the law, and it now applies to you. All right. Again, baby bonding, child bonding applies within the first year of the child's birth or the child's placement in your home. You can require reasonable notice, and you should require reasonable notice. So one of the things that we have in our employee handbooks talks about, this pregnancy disability leave once you've been released. If you want baby bonding leave, you must request that time off, just like you have to request any other time off. Submit a written request, we evaluate it. Sometimes employers have a situation where employee says, I don't want 12 weeks of time off, but my spouse is off work on Thursdays and Fridays. So can I work Thursdays and Fridays and then have baby bonding on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays? You're not actually required to allow intermittent leave for baby or child bonding, but it certainly may be to your benefit to do so. So if that comes up, that is one area where you're not required to accommodate intermittent leave. You can choose whether or not you want to based on what your own staffing needs are. You can also provide some compromise version of that. So if an employee says, I can work Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, I can't work Tuesdays and Thursdays, you may be willing to say, okay, well, I'm willing to have you work Mondays and Wednesdays, but I already have folks here on Fridays, so I'm not going to have you work on the Fridays. That's the compromise. That works too, again, because in baby bonding or child bonding, you're not required to accommodate the intermittent leave. Okay, unpaid. Again, they qualify for paid family leave benefits, just as they did under family caregiver leave. All the same analysis applies. Fourth kind of CFRA leave, qualifying exigency leave. So your employee has a family member who is a member of the military, and family member is defined, I believe it's parent, spouse, or child. Here in California, anything that applies to a spouse also applies to a registered domestic partner. So if you have one of those folks who's been called up for duty, or they're on active duty, your employee does. That employee has the availability of job protected CFRA leave for a whole variety of things, such as attending a military event, arranging for childcare. So my spouse has been called up immediately. My spouse usually cares for my child. I'm going to need a week or two off to figure out where my children are going to go for childcare. Your employee may be required to go to school to meet with the teachers or whoever because of something happening related to that duty. May need time off for counseling, may need time off for post-deployment. Spouse is coming home from the military. There's going to be some kind of activities related, job protected time off, to make this financial or legal arrangements, certainly to take time off in the event of the death of a covered service member. And then the CFRA gives us, at the end of all that, or other such reasons, which kind of means almost anything related to the employee's family member being called up for duty or being on active duty. Again, may include intermittent leave. Same rules apply as we've been talking about. It's unpaid. Paid family leave may be available depending on the reason for the leave. They may choose to use paid sick leave if it applies to the reason for leave. So for example, if an employee needs time off to go to counseling because they're struggling with depression, right? That is a medical reason. Therefore, they can use paid sick leave. If that employee needs time off because they need to make some financial arrangements, go to the bank, do some paperwork, that is not a paid sick leave purpose. They may not use paid sick leave for that purpose, but they may use, or you may choose to require them to use, any available vacation leave benefits. All right. CFRA dues. I do want you to require medical certification for any CFRA leave that has a health-related reason, whether it's for the employee or for their family member for whom they're going to be a family caregiver. Doesn't apply to baby or child bonding. You're going to require documentation that the child was placed in the employee's home. I've never heard of anybody doing that. And if you are going to do that, just make sure that you're consistent, not applying it differently to different employees. I do suggest that you require some documentation of the need for a qualifying exigency leave. I'm not saying you need to. I'm suggesting it, and again, that may vary depending on the reason for the leave. These rules and laws change sometimes, so there's another reason to every single year update those posters that you're supposed to have up. There are certain required notices. There are certain notices that are not required, but that are recommended. Again, I want you to think about documentation, documentation, documentation. You can never over-document something. So make sure that we're getting all those notices out to employees for any of these kinds of CFRA leaves of absence. I want you to calendar any relevant dates. So if you get a doctor's note that says Sally's going to be off work for 6 weeks and she'll be able to return to work on May 2nd, I want you to calendar May 2nd. I probably want you to calendar a week before May 2nd to check in with Sally. If Sally hasn't already reached out to you, figure out what's going on. I want you to calendar any time that their CFRA leave will expire. So if Sally's only out for 6 weeks, go ahead and calendar that 12 weeks because you may very well get an extension note, right? Oh, it turns out Sally's not ready to come back at 6 weeks. So go ahead and calendar that 12 weeks just so that you have all those things already in place, and you'll have reminders of if any of those dates come up and you haven't heard from Sally. Make sure that your written policies are current, that they are compliant, that they explain things like the employee has to pay their own health insurance, and they explain things like how long you'll pay their health insurance. They explain things like the employee is required to get in touch with you 1 week before expiration to confirm that they're coming back on the expected date. It explains things like if they do not request an extension before that leave of absence has expired and provide you with another doctor's note, they may be deemed to have abandoned their employment. So I want your employee handbooks to be current. I want your written policies to be current. I want them to be fully compliant. And I want them to communicate the things that you want to communicate so that you can then require that employees comply with all of that because it's part of your policies. All right, some CFRA do nots. Oh, Andrew has given us our first attendance poll. So if you are busy taking notes and not looking at the screen, jump up real quick, click on yes or no that you are still watching the program. All right, let's see if I can move this out of my way. All right, so CFRA do nots. Employees have a right to privacy under HIPAA. You all know far more about HIPAA than I do. They have a right to privacy as to all of their personal health information. You have a right to certain information, like the information that's requested on a healthcare provider certification form, but you do not have a right to additional information. You actually don't have a right to ask them what's wrong with them. You don't have a right to ask them what medication are they taking. You don't have a right to ask them what treatment are they getting. You don't have a right to ask them what their doctor said. You have a right to certain limited information, which is just information sufficient to allow you to determine, do they qualify for a leave of absence or some other reasonable accommodation. So don't ask too many questions. By the way, you never have a right to call their doctor and ask their doctor questions, with one exception. If you get a doctor's note and you think that it's not real, and this happens, you may call that doctor's office or fax that doctor's office or email that doctor's office to say, here's the note that Sally gave me. Is this from your office? Is this true and correct the way that you provided it? That's the only thing you may contact an employee's healthcare provider directly to do. All right, of course, do not disclose anybody's private HIPAA protected personal health information. Just as you would not take a patient's information and start talking about it with other people, your employees have the exact same HIPAA rights. So you do not tell a coworker why Sally is out. None of the coworker's business. If Sally wants to tell somebody, she can certainly do that, but you do not disclose anybody's private personal health information. If somebody asks you, you simply say, I can't disclose that any more than I could disclose your health information to somebody else. All right. I don't want you to be too relaxed about these things that I'm talking about with documentation, doctor's notes, medical certification, calendaring your relevant dates. That's what gets you into trouble, where you end up having an employee that's been out for 2 or 3 or 4 months. Can I require that they come back? Can I fire them because they haven't come back? What can I do? And my answer to you can be, I don't know, because we don't know if they're still out on a job protected leave. We don't know how long that job protected leave actually lasted and if they've been just off lollygagging since that time. We need to have all the information. So don't be lax about that. Ask them for it, get it, calendar those dates. Now, once a CFRA leave has ended because the 12 weeks has expired, or if that employee never qualified for the CFRA leave, they haven't worked for you for a year, or they didn't work 1,250 hours during the last 12 months, you still may have an obligation to provide FEHA, Fair Employment and Housing Act, medical leave of absence, and to engage in the interactive process, determine if there's reasonable accommodations, determine if there's undue hardship. We're going to talk about all of that in a few minutes, but I want you to be aware that this 12 weeks is not a clock that when that 12 week strikes, you're done, you can terminate employment. That is not the case. We just move into this other section of potentially job protected leave. All right, of course, never terminate an employee who's on a CFRA leave or who's requested a CFRA leave without seeking the advice of legal counsel, because we really need to go through and evaluate what is your risk. Are you willing to take that risk? Are there things you can do to lessen that risk? And why should you or shouldn't you do those things? So talk to legal counsel if you're feeling the need to terminate employment for anybody who's requested any kind of leave of absence or who's on any kind of a leave of absence. All right, before we leave CFRA, do we have any questions on CFRA? Let me go into the Q&A. There are no open questions in the Q&A. All right, so CFRA is one form of leave of absence. There are many forms of leave of absence, unfortunately for most of us. Many of them are protected, some are not. We're going to talk a little bit about what are not job protected leaves of absence, and it's really your choice. But with respect to almost all of the leaves of absence, they almost all have some number of employees which qualifies you as having to provide those. So if you have more than 5 or more employees, you must provide CFRA leave. If you have 5 or more employees, you have to provide FEHA analysis of engaging in the interactive process, reasonable accommodation, undue hardship, and maybe provide the accommodation. So we're going to talk about some of those leaves. The 3 most common categories, the first one is medical leave, which is, again, now going to fall under CFRA. The other 2 really common ones are workers' comp leave, which now also qualifies as CFRA leave, and pregnancy disability leave, which is not a CFRA leave, pregnancy disability leave, and then CFRA baby bonding leave. All right, so for this next section, let's pop over to our handout that hopefully all of you have. And we're going to go to the first numbered page 1. So here's the way this handout is set up. I've got this handy dandy little table. We're going to go through the table, talk about the different types of leaves of absence, and then we'll come back to our PowerPoint slide. So in fact, you know what, let me pull up, I can pull up the handout just in case you all don't have it right there in front of you. Let me make it easy. Here it is. Okay, let me share this instead. All right, so here's what our handy little table looks like, and we'll go through it together. So starting out with workers' comp leave of absence. Of course, it applies to every single employer who has any employees. 1 or more, you're required to have workers' comp leave of absence. There is no defined period of time for a job protected workers' comp leave of absence. It depends on what the medical certification says. Workers' comp leave of absence applies to any work-related injury or illness that requires some kind of leave of absence or time off. Medical certification, you absolutely can and should require medical certification from the workers' comp clinic, or sometimes employees don't go to the workers' comp clinic. They can designate their own healthcare provider. So, but either way, you want that medical certification. Workers' comp leave is the broadest in terms of it includes everybody. There's no statutory defined period, and it's going to include every work-related injury or illness for which there is medical certification. Now, one of the things, by the way, I should have explained to you how this table works. 5 columns, far left column, the type we're talking about, who it applies to, if you have this many employees, what's the protected leave period, what's the brief description of what that particular leave of absence is, and then kind of my notes of what I think are the key things to keep in mind about these leaves of absence. So one of the things about a workers' comp leave of absence that I have found to be pretty consistently true is that workers' comp want you to get your employee back to work. Why do they want that? Because then they have to pay the benefits for being off work. So your carrier, your claims adjustment representative is going to encourage you to provide light duty. Now, under the reasonable accommodation analysis, you are required to provide light duty, but you are not required to bend over backwards to provide. You are not required to create a job to accommodate light duty. This is particularly true in workers' comp because honestly, most of the time, the employee is going to be very off work entirely while they're on workers' comp because they're getting paid by workers' comp. So when we talk about reasonable accommodation, I absolutely want you to do the analysis, but I'm going to tell you to give yourself a little bit more leeway only in the context of a workers' comp leave, because in reality, that employee is probably not going to be mad if you don't give them light duty and force them to come back to work. Again, very high risk to terminate employment for anybody who's on a workers' comp leave or has even put you on notice that they have a work-related injury or illness. Don't take any adverse action without talking to legal counsel. All right, a couple more notes that I want to throw in about workers' comp. First of all, if any of you don't have workers' comp coverage, and I don't know any dentists who fall in this category, but I do have some other employers who fall in this category, it is a crime And I personally know somebody who went to prison for 2 years. He owned a moving company. I used that moving company in years past. That's how I knew them. And he called me when he got this thing came up. He did not have workers' comp insurance. He had an employee who became very seriously injured. They threw the owner in prison for 2 years. It is illegal criminally, not just civilly, to not have workers' comp insurance. So if you're struggling financially, pick something else. I know not paying your taxes is bad and can get you into all kinds of trouble. It won't get you thrown into prison. Not having workers' comp insurance might. As I mentioned before, workers' comp leave qualifies as a CFRA leave. So it may not be an automatic trigger in your brain to remember, oh yeah, I need to give notice, but go ahead and give notice. You don't want somebody to go out on a workers' comp leave for 4 months, come back, and then the next month say, oh, I fell down the stairs and hurt my ankle. I need to be off my feet for 3 weeks. Now they have potentially job protected CFRA leave. We want that CFRA leave to expire. We want it to run out. So make sure that you're giving notice of it. All right. We talked about an employee's medical leave under CFRA. An employee may also have a medical leave that's not CFRA. That generally happens in one of two ways. The first is that the CFRA leave expired and the employee is not able to come back to work yet. The second way is that employee didn't qualify for CFRA leave because they hadn't worked there for a year or had not worked 1,250 hours in the prior 12 months. Now we have the Fair Employment and Housing Act statutes that tell us we may have to reasonably accommodate that employee's leave of absence. So this applies if you have 5 or more employees. So same thing as CFRA. If CFRA applies to you, FEHA will apply to you. This is not a statutorily defined period of time. You are just required to reasonably accommodate for as long as you can reasonably do so without undue hardship. You can and should require medical certification. It applies to an employee who has a disability that limits a major life activity. We're going to get into that definition in a few minutes when we talk more about reasonable accommodation. But again, really wanting to plant that seed that if you have an employee who needs to be off work and they are not eligible for CFRA leave or they don't have any CFRA leave availability left, you absolutely still have some obligation to potentially give them the time off. Again, medical certification is going to be key. Documentation of all communications is going to be key. Having a good written policy that explains how it works, what their obligations are, what your obligations are, is going to really help you to be able to enforce and determine what you need to do and what they need to do. Again, I want you to calendar those doctor's notes. I want you to calendar those dates. I want you to calendar return dates. I want you to calendar a week ahead of time to make sure that you have some idea of whether they're going to stay out or they're not going to stay out. If that date comes and goes, an employee is supposed to return to work on April 1, whether it's a CFRA leave, whether it's a FEHA leave, whether it's a workers' comp leave, no matter what kind of leave it is, if that doctor's note gives a return date, that return date comes and goes, that employee has not returned, that employee has not reached out, that employee has not requested additional time off, that employee may have abandoned their job. Here's why I say may have abandoned their job. Because it's possible that there's a reason they did not communicate. It's possible that their doctor's office said, we'll send the doctor's note for you, and then the doctor's office didn't send it. It's possible that they didn't respond because they've been in the hospital all this time and didn't even realize that date had come and gone. So what we do at these points in time where that time has expired, they haven't been in touch, you haven't heard anything, you don't have a new doctor's note, is we send a letter that says, your approved leave of absence expired on March 31st, 2021. You haven't returned, you haven't requested additional time off, you haven't provided additional medical certification. Therefore, we assume that you have chosen to resign or have abandoned your job. If this was not your intention, get in touch with me immediately. Otherwise, your job is deemed concluded. If you owe any final paycheck, maybe you owe some final vacation pay, here's your final vacation pay. Here's your EDD form about change of employment relationship. And the reason we're doing that is to give the employee the opportunity for a brief period of time to reach out to you and say, oh my gosh, my doctor's office said they were going to send the note. I'm going to go get it right now. I'll bring it right over to you. In that case, you probably need to allow for that, but it's going to be very limited reasons why you need to accommodate the employee not having reached out. Again, I hope that your good current policy makes very clear When that leave expires, if you have not reached out, told us you needed more time, provided medical certification, told us why you can't return that date, you will be deemed to have abandoned your job. I want your policy to say it so you can reinforce it. Say, no, see, here's the policy. This is how it works. All right. Again, you got somebody out on a fee-held leave of absence. Perhaps it's just going on and on and on and on, and you want to terminate employment. You may be able to do so. Talk to legal counsel before you do that, whether it's me or somebody else. Make sure that you're talking through all of the facts of that particular situation before you just decide to say, I can't hold the job open anymore. I'm terminating your employment. All right. The third most common leave of absence for dental practices in particular is pregnancy disability leave, which we get via the Pregnancy Disability Act. So pregnancy disability, again, applies if you have 5 or more employees. It provides the employee with up to 4 months of job protected time off. Again, why the legislature chose months here and weeks under CFRA, I don't know, because they don't really think about whether things make any sense. They don't really think about whether they're making it easier or difficult for the employer to comply. They just throw this nonsense out there without paying any attention to, will this work in the real world where all the rest of us live? All right, soapbox down for the moment. Up to 4 months, pregnancy disability leave is the time during which the employee's healthcare provider, that can be a doctor, it can be a nurse practitioner, it can be a certified nurse midwife, licensed midwife, healthcare provider designates her as unable to work due to pregnancy or a pregnancy-related condition like childbirth, like postpartum depression, like severe morning sickness, like I have a high-risk pregnancy and I have to be on bed rest. Those are all reasons that fall under the Pregnancy Disability Act. They all qualify as pregnancy disability leave, and they all count towards that 4 months. So the 4 months isn't just at the end of the pregnancy and then the child's born and then after the child's born. It is all the time off that the employee takes for pregnancy disability reasons from the time that she becomes pregnant until the time that the doctor releases her to return to work postpartum. Many employers refer to maternity leave. Maternity leave isn't a thing. It's not a category. It doesn't mean anything that you need it to mean. Maternity leave simply means my employee's off work for all sorts of reasons related to pregnancy and baby bonding, and I want to stay home and I don't have childcare. I don't want you to refer to maternity leave. It is too gray. It does not give you any protection. It does not give you any instruction. It doesn't give the employee any instruction. I want you to refer to pregnancy disability leave. I want you to require medical certification, not for a day off here and there for morning sickness, but for extended periods of leave related to pregnancy or related conditions. I want you to be clear that it's pregnancy disability leave so that that clock is running and we know when that clock ends. I want you to require medical certification so we know when that clock is running and when that clock ends. Usually what happens is you'll get a note ahead of time. Sally's due date is March 1st. Therefore, I am writing her off work from February 1st until April 15th, because normally, normal pregnancy, not high risk, no C-section anticipated, any healthcare provider will write mom out for 4 weeks before, 1 month before the due date, and for 6 weeks postpartum, automatic, no questions asked. Now that time may very well be extended, right? She may need to be off work prior to the 1 month before. She may need to be off work more than 6 weeks after. C-section is generally 8 weeks. All sorts of reasons. There can be complications that can extend that. You want all that time counting towards the pregnancy disability leave, and you want to know when that pregnancy disability leave ends. So not only do you get that doctor's note when mom's pregnant, so you know the anticipated time off, your good current employee handbook and policy should tell the employee that when the baby's born, you will need any updated certification if that date is going to change. If you don't get new certification, you are going to assume that that date is still valid and the employee will be returning on that date. Again, when you're doing the documentation, the employee gives you the doctor's note, you give documentation back, your request for leave of absence for pregnancy disability is approved from February 1 to April 15th. Remind them at that point in time. If after the child's born, that April 15th date is not going to remain as the right date, we will need new medical certification in advance of April 15th. In that note, you'll also remind them, if you wish to take baby bonding time after that, you must request it in advance. Let us know, because it's not just automatic. So pregnancy disability leave is one thing. Baby bonding leave is another thing. Baby bonding leave begins when pregnancy disability leave ends, unless the employee chooses to have it be later. So an employee may say, I'm going to come back as soon as my pregnancy disability leave ends, because my spouse has 12 weeks of baby bonding leave, and my spouse is going to take that 12 weeks right after my pregnancy disability leave ends. Then after that 12 weeks, I want to take my 12 weeks of baby bonding leave. They're entitled to do, because it's any time within that first year. I know that's going to make your life very difficult. I'm very sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you, but the legislature in all of its wisdom decided this applies to anybody with 5 or more employees. So there you have it. The one thing that I really want you to be aware of also with pregnancy disability leave that is different than any other leave. Most of the leaves, you're allowed to return the employee to their same position or a comparable, equivalent, similar, very similar position. Pregnancy disability leave, you are required to return that employee to her exact same position, exact same days, exact same hours, exact same job duties, exact same everything, exactly the same. That's your requirement, as long as she comes back to work right after her pregnancy disability leave ends. But sometimes what happens is a new mom will say, can I change my schedule? Instead of working 4 days a week, can I work 2 days a week? Instead of working 8 hours a day, can I work 6 hours a day? She may request a change in the schedule. You are not required to accommodate a requested change in schedule due to childcare, due to I want to be at home, I don't want to have to work these long hours, I want to spend more time with the baby. You don't have to accommodate any of that. You can choose to, but your legal obligation was to give the exact same job back. Once employee requests a change, I want you to ask that employee, you know what, do me a favor, send that to me in an email, because I want you to have documentation that you didn't change their schedule. They requested a change in schedule. I want that documented. So have them give you something in writing, email, handwritten note, whatever, put that in the personnel file so that you will always have evidence that you did not change the schedule. You were willing to accommodate them coming back to the exact same schedule. All right. The only exception to that will be if the employee needs some accommodation for some FEHA protected reason. I need, once my pregnancy disability leave ends, I'm going to need some additional time off because I continue to be disabled, because my child is very ill and I have to provide family care to that child. So there may be some other reasons why we have to accommodate that. Seek legal counsel, because all that starts getting very convoluted when you're looking at this leave, that leave, this leave, that leave, this time period, that doctor's note. Let us help you sort through that if you have an employee who gets into that kind of a situation. Again, can't reinforce it enough. Have really good written policies that are current, that are compliant, that kind of spell out all the things that apply. All right, I'm going to race through the rest of these leaves because we've covered the most common leaves: CFRA, workers' comp, which may or may not be CFRA, FEHA leave, which is if there's no CFRA leave available, pregnancy disability leave, baby bonding that goes along with that, pregnancy disability leave because it falls under CFRA. So I'm going to race through the rest of these just to kind of plant the seed for you that there's these other things out there that you need to be aware of. All right, donor leave. If you have 15 or more employees, you're required to give leave of absence for an employee to be a donor, either of bone marrow or of an organ. The rules are a little bit different depending on which they're donating. It does not apply to the recipient. The recipient may be eligible for leave under CFRA or under FEHA, but the donor leave is just really to encourage and help employees to be able to afford time off to give bone marrow or to donate an organ. Now, this is the one leave that is required as a paid leave of absence. It's the only one. All the other leaves at this moment in time are unpaid. We'll see what the legislature does in the future, but as of right now, this is the only paid leave. There's some rules about how that applies. I'm not going to go into it. You're not going to remember it. If it ever comes up, you can look at this cheat sheet or you can call me, we'll go through it. The ADA, we really don't even talk about here in California because A, it applies if you have 15 or more employees, but the FEHA applies if you have 5 or more. Plus, disability is more narrow under the ADA. It applies if you have a disability that substantially limits a major life activity. Here in California, we define a disability as a condition that limits a major life activity. So ADA is just something that we, from an employment standpoint, we don't deal with very much here in California. All right, we've talked about CFRA leaves. We've talked about FMLA a little bit. I'm not going to get into it. It applies if you have 50 or more employees. It has mostly the same kinds of leaves as CFRA, with the exception of this bottom one on page, whatever page I'm on, I can't see the page number. Military caregiver leave if you have 50 or more employees, and your employee has a family member who's a military member who was seriously injured, and that employee needs to care for them. FMLA gives that employee up to 26 weeks of job protected time off for that reason. All right, quickly, other leaves. Ooh, Andrew has given us our second attendance poll. Again, if you're not looking at the screen, pop up, take a look, answer yes or no that you are in attendance to make sure that you get your CE credits. Let's see if I can move this over a bit. All right. Alcohol drug rehab. If you have 25 or more employees and you have an employee who comes to you and says, I need to go to rehab, you are required to provide that accommodation for time off. Again, not going to get into the weeds on this, but if you have 25 or more employees and that comes up, take a look at this cheat sheet or give me a call. We have 3 versions of crime victim leave. It applies if you have 1 employee. It applies if you have 25 employees. The bottom line is if somebody is the victim of a serious crime or stalking or something similar, they probably have some job protected time off for various reasons related to that. We have 3 versions of emergency personnel. If I'm a volunteer firefighter, if I'm a reserve peace officer, if I'm a member of the California Civil Air Patrol, if I am a volunteer firefighter, there's time off for various things under those categories. Of course, jury duty, if an employee has to go to jury duty, you must provide the time off, whether it's 1 day, whether it's 12 weeks, no matter how long they're on jury duty, it is job protected time off. It is unpaid. They can use their vacation. They cannot use their sick leave. It's not a sick leave purpose. If you have an exempt employee, we talked about that in February, what that is. You may have to pay for their time off if they're going to be also working from home, maybe at night or during other times. Call me, we'll talk about that if it comes up. If you have an employee who's a member of the military, so either because they've recently enlisted or perhaps they're a reservist, they have to take military leave. They're called up for, whether it's for training purposes or for other purposes, that is job protected time off. If you have 25 or more employees or 50 or more employees and that person is a spouse or registered domestic partner of a military member, you may have to give some time off. We have 2 categories of school leave. The first one applies to everybody, which is basically if your employee says to you, I have to go to school for a teacher conference, I have to go to school because my kid's in trouble and they might suspend or expel them, you have to give time off for that purpose. If you have 25 or more employees, that employee is eligible for up to 40 hours off per year, unpaid time off, to attend school activities, to go on school field trips, do all sorts of things. Those are 2 types of school leave. And last in this category of leaves is voting leave. The law requires that we provide up to 2 hours of paid time off at the beginning or end of a shift if the employee needs that time off in order to vote. Here in California, for dental offices, that should virtually never apply. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And unless your employee just lives some ridiculously amount of miles away from a polling place, you should not have to give paid time off for them to vote. All right, other laws related to leaves of absence. So these first 2 are, remember I mentioned that there's leaves that you don't have to provide. You do not have to provide bereavement leave. If you want to, you can. Certainly if somebody dies, you may want to provide that time off, but it doesn't have to be paid time off. And just to be clear, paid sick leave cannot be used for bereavement leave. So, as silly as it sounds, an employee may use their sick leave purposes because their family member is critically ill and they're home with them caring for them. Once that family member passes, they can no longer use paid sick leave because they're no longer caring for that sick family member. I know that sounds weird, but that's the way the rules work. Personal leave, somebody may need a personal leave of absence for some time off that is not covered under any of these leaves. It's hard to even imagine what that might be. You may choose to provide that personal leave. You don't have to. You can kind of set whatever rules you want to with that kind of personal leave that's not a job protected leave. So those are the 2 that we kind of think about as being not required, not job protected. You can kind of do what you want to do. Again, these next 2 are just buckets of money. Paid family leave is available, and I did not update this, I'm so sorry. Paid family leave is available for up to 8 weeks, not 6. It changed about a year and a half ago. And it's available to any employee who has time off for any paid family leave reason. SDI is another bucket of money. It's available for up to 1 year for an employee's own health-related absence. It does not apply if it's a job-related absence where it's workers' comp. It does apply if it's a not job-related medical leave of absence. And it's amazing how employees sometimes magically become better at 52 weeks when their SDI expires. All right, employee literacy. I can't imagine this would apply to any dental practice, but if you have 25 or more employees and somebody needs time off or some other reasonable accommodation due to literacy issues, that's job protected. Cal Cobra and Cobra, simply to say, again, these are not leaves of absence, but related to if somebody's off work once that CFRA leave expires, or that pregnancy disability leave expires, or that FMLA leave expires, you are no longer required to keep them on health insurance, but you are required to offer them Cal Cobra, which is the same thing as Cobra basically, that's another one of those reasons why you want to track those dates, because once those dates expire, you are no longer legally required to continue to pay for the insurance. I have employers who don't track those dates, and they'll have employee off on workers' comp leave of absence for a year, and the employers continue to pay the health insurance because they just didn't think about it. So mark those dates, track those things, don't pay more money than you have to, unless you want to, unless you choose to, and you certainly may choose to for any number of reasons.
Anita, if I could just stop for a second. We're getting a couple things in the Q&A that people aren't able to see your screen. However, I am able to see your screen. So folks, if you have a technical issue, please put it in the chat section, because there may be some back and forth that I need to do with you, and the Q&A isn't the right place for that. However, Anita, one thing is that would you scroll down a little bit on that handout so that people could see the bottom of it? That was one request.
Oh yeah, so on this one I was scrolling as I was using. This next one we're not going to get to for a few minutes. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect.
All right. So we've now gone through a ton of types of leaves of absence, a ton of reasons why you have to give time off. But sometimes the employee doesn't necessarily need time off. They need some other type of leave of absence. So whether they're, again, CFRA, they get their leave, there's no reasonable accommodation analysis. Pregnancy, they get their leave, there's no reasonable accommodation analysis. FEHA is a type of leave for which we do have a reasonable accommodation analysis. And other accommodations that may be requested, we do have a reasonable accommodation analysis. So FEHA medical leave, FEHA reasonable accommodation applies to everybody who has 5 or more employees. Again, everyone counts. It applies if the individual has a qualifying disability. So again, you may have the handout in front of you. If you do, you can take a look at that. Otherwise, I'm going to attempt to bring back up this form, this other document. So I will scroll down as we go through. This is 2 pages of how California defines a disability. Let me summarize it for you in one sentence. Almost everything is a disability. Second sentence, almost everybody has a disability as defined under California law. But let me be a little bit more specific just so you have a sense of what all this means. So disability is broadly construed, that's an understatement, to include all the following. So mental disability. Mental disability may include learning disabilities. It may include diagnosed depression, diagnosed bipolar disorder, diagnosed PTSD. So all these things diagnosed qualify as disabilities. If somebody needs time off or some other reasonable accommodation for a mental disability, you have a requirement to go through the analysis and possibly provide it. Physical disability is a condition that affects one or more of the following bodies. The body systems named include everything. Plus, it limits a major life activity. Work is a major life activity. So if somebody has a condition that affects one or more of those symptoms and it limits their ability to work, poof, it is now a qualifying disability. It includes all sorts of things. Item C here gives us some of those examples. Disability also includes a special education disability. I think this is primarily talking about, so these fall under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. So I think these are to give sort of some other things. We already had our definition up here in mental disability that probably is going to fall into anything that you're going to be concerned with. Disability also includes a record or history of having had a disability previously. It also includes a perceived disability. If you think somebody has a disability and you make a decision on that basis, that is disability discrimination, even if they don't actually have that disability. It also includes a perceived potential disability. I think that you may have bipolar disorder, and so I am not going to promote you to office manager position. Even if they don't have it, even if your perception was wrong, even your perception that they might potentially have it is wrong, that is disability discrimination. Medical condition, just to make things more complicated, is actually separately defined. So we have disability, which is all these other things, right? Almost everything's going to fall under one of those. Medical condition under this particular statutory scheme is one of two things. It is cancer or a cancer-related impairment, or a history of having had cancer, or a genetic characteristic as defined here. So I don't know why they make medical condition more complicated, but it's more narrow. Everything else is a disability. All right. It also includes disability as defined under ADA. Believe me, ADA's got nothing on the FIHA. We include everything. A disability does not include the following. Does not include compulsive gambling, kleptomania, pyromania, or basically alcohol or substance abuse that is occurring right now. Now, if somebody is a recovering alcoholic, a recovering addict, that is protected. What is not protected is somebody's current unlawful use or abuse of a controlled substance. Sexual behavior disorders such as pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism, you do not have to provide job protection for those things. You can fire somebody if it's an issue. All right. It also does not include conditions that are mild. And this is where we really get into that gray area sometimes. And we're trying to figure out, does it fall into this excluded category of a mild condition, or is it qualifying as a disability? And again, seek legal counsel. Let's go through the analysis. But basically, the regulations give us these examples of the common cold, seasonal or common influenza, doesn't apply to COVID, minor cuts, sprains, muscle aches, soreness, bruises, abrasions, non-migraine headaches, which conversely then tells you migraine headaches are a disability, minor non-chronic tummy aches, not a disability. All right, so basically everybody can come up with a disability, and basically almost everything as a medical condition may qualify as a disability, except in these limited categories below. All right, let's bring back up, oh, I did not do that right. Let's bring back up my PowerPoint. All right, so we have a sense that almost everything's going to be a disability. Somebody says, I have migraines and I may need time off work because of my migraines. You can and should require a doctor's note, document. All right, so assuming that's the case, what does the Fair Employment and Housing Act require of you? It requires that you engage in the interactive process, which means communicate, talk, email, text message, notes, medical certification. These are all forms of communication that are part of the required engaging in the interactive process. By the way, the employee also has a duty to engage in the interactive process. So if you're asking for medical certification, they're not giving it, the employee has not met his burden to engage in the interactive process, and you can take action saying if there's no doctor's note, then it's not an approved leave of absence, or I am not going to accommodate. All right, you engage in the interactive process in order to determine if there's a reasonable accommodation that you may provide that will allow the employee to keep their job, not lose their job, unless there's an undue hardship on the employer, which is incredibly difficult to prove and incredibly frustrating. Believe me, I get it. All right, so let's start with engaging in the interactive process. What does it mean? Again, communicating, any form of communication. Does it mean communicating with a family member? It only means communicating with a family member if whatever the condition is prevents the employee from being able to communicate. So family member calls and says, Susie was in a car accident, she's in the hospital, I just want to let you know she's not going to be at work. That is going to be a form of putting you on notice that there's probably a job protected reason for that employee's absence. It means medical certifications. It means releases. Oftentimes, I recommend that you not allow that employee to come back to work after 3-4 months off work without having a doctor's note saying Susie's released to return to work, with or without restrictions. If there are restrictions, then we evaluate those restrictions under this reasonable accommodation analysis. They refuse to provide medical certification, you do not have to provide job protected time off. If the employee's healthcare provider says the employee doesn't need this time off, and the employee says, yes, I do, the employee disagrees with the healthcare provider, the employee may go get a second opinion, that's up to them. What if the employee's health certification says employee is going to need 6 months off because of ABC? You are allowed to require a second opinion. You are allowed to designate a healthcare provider to provide a second opinion, and that employee is required to go. You pay for their time, right? Because they're under your control, they're working. You pay for the all costs of that medical appointment. If that appointment disagrees with the first one, now maybe we get a third one. Again, you get to pay for it. And the rules actually say, assuming that there's a first, assuming there's a second, the third one, whatever the third one says, that goes, period and subject, that one wins. I haven't had situations where this has happened, but it is an option if you're getting doctor's notes that you just think are fraudulent. What if the leave of absence expires? No show, no call. We've already talked about that. We're going to communicate with the employee by sending a letter that says something like, we assume that you've resigned and abandoned your job. Document, 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 document. I can't say that enough. All right. So your first duty is to engage in the interactive process to determine if there's a reasonable accommodation that you can provide. Maybe a leave of absence, maybe an intermittent leave of absence. Reasonable accommodation, maybe I've been on a leave of absence for 2 months and I can't come back to full time yet, but I can come back slowly. We used to have an employee who had multiple sclerosis, and when she would have to go out on leaves because of flares, in order to come back, she needed to come back more gradually. She couldn't just jump right back in. So we'd have her come in for 4 hours, then 5 hours, then 6 hours, and 7 hours to build back up to a full day. Was it inconvenient? Absolutely. We only have about 10 employees. But it was a reasonable accommodation. We were able to provide it. We would not have been able to prove undue hardship. So that became part, and we wanted to anyways, but that did become part of our reasonable accommodation of her qualifying disability. Maybe flexible work schedule, maybe you can do it, maybe you can't. Flexibility of when to sit, stand, walk around. If you have a front office employee who's needing some accommodation to be able to sit and stand and walk around alternately, you can probably accommodate that. If you have a hygienist, chairside assistant who needs to be accommodated with respect to when they need to be able to sit, stand, walk around, you may not be able to accommodate that, in which case they remain off work on a leave of absence. They may need some additional rest breaks. Work from home may be the accommodation. We're seeing a lot more of that now because folks were working from home with COVID. Not so much in dental offices, but some dental offices for billing people, for your billing employee, the person who does your billing. So that may be a reasonable accommodation. Again, we're going to do the whole analysis, engage in the interactive process, get that doctor's note. Can you reasonably accommodate that? Maybe a change in some duties, maybe providing some certain ergonomics, a different chair, a different monitor. Those are all reasonable accommodations that you have to evaluate, unless it imposes an undue hardship. What is that? Good question. Very difficult to prove. And if you tell somebody, I am not going to reasonably accommodate you because it's an undue hardship, you better be ready to convince a jury that you could not accommodate, because there's a decent chance that employee is going to be ticked off and unhappy that you fired them rather than reasonably accommodating them, or you in some other way did not allow them that reasonable accommodation. And if there's a claim, that's what it's going to come down to. Can you prove to a jury? Can you prove to a hearing officer? Can you prove to a judge that it was absolutely an undue hardship? What does that analysis look like? What is the nature and cost of the accommodation? What are your financial resources? And again, if you're having to prove undue hardship, you're going to be handing over your financials in order to prove I couldn't afford it. You can't just say it was too expensive. Prove it. Prove that you do not have the financial resources that you could have paid for that monitor, that chair. You couldn't have afforded to hire a temp while that person was out because a temp is more expensive. The size of your business, number of persons employed, nature of your business, those are all factors that can be looked at to decide, could you provide the reasonable accommodation without an undue hardship? Could your other employees have covered for that person for a while? Can you hire a temp? Part of what's happening right now, I don't need to tell you, it's very difficult to find employees for dental practices. That necessarily means it's difficult to find good temps, because If you can't find regular employees, you're probably not going to find temps. In order to prove undue hardship, because we had to have somebody fill that position, we only have one front office employee. We only have 2 back office employees. We only have 4 hygienists. We have to have a front office employee at all times. We couldn't find a temp, therefore we had to hire somebody. It was an undue hardship to hold the job open. You better be able to prove that you could not hire a temp. That means you need to try to hire a temp. That means you need to document your efforts to hire a temp. You need to document who you tried to hire, what they said, when they said it, to be able to prove, no, here's my proof, I did. I didn't worry about the nature and cost. I didn't worry about my resources. I didn't worry about the size of my business. I had to have an employee there because the nature of my business requires somebody at the front desk at all times, and I could not hire a temp, therefore I could not. You need to be able to prove it. So undue hardship is tough to prove, and if you're going to claim it as a reason for not reasonably accommodating, you better be ready to prove it because you may very well have to. All right, quick hypothetical. Associate dentist orthodontist has multiple sclerosis, requests an adjustment in his work schedule from 9 to 6 instead of 8 to 5 because mornings are tough and it just takes him a lot longer to kind of get going. Can you accommodate that? So again, this is an orthodontist. So orthodontists generally have multiple RDAs who are assisting them, right? 2 or 3 RDAs assist the dentist, can't do their jobs without the dentist. So if the dentist isn't there, the RDAs aren't there, that means that we need to change the RDA's schedule. What does that analysis look like? Well, we go to the RDAs, we say, can you change your schedule from 9 to 6? We look at our patient census. Do we think that enough patients that would want to come at 8 a.m. would be willing to come at 5 p.m.? You look at all those things and determine, can you reasonably accommodate? If you can, all of the things fall in place, then you have a duty to. If you can't, right? 2 out of the 3 RDAs say they cannot work past 5:30 because they have to pick their kids up from childcare, cannot accommodate. Is there a different reasonable accommodation? Well, maybe that dentist can work 8:30 to 5:30. Maybe that dentist can work 9 to 5:30. Maybe the other RDAs can come in at 8 or 8:30 and work until 5, and the other ones can come in at 8:30 or 9 and work until 5:30 or 6. You have to look at all the different ways to potentially be able to reasonably accommodate. Hygienist was injured in a skiing accident, has restrictions that limit her ability to stand for more than 15 minutes, as well as bend, twist, reach, lift, push, or pull. Can that hygienist do her hygienist job with those restrictions? No. Is there a different position? Well, it turns out that we happen to have a front office position available, and this hygienist used to be a front office person, so she knows the software, she knows how to do it. Can we put her in that position, at least temporarily? Sure. Maybe you don't have a position available, in which case the reasonable accommodation is the leave of absence. All right, just want to throw out, so we have our third attendance poll. It popped up, so jump up, answer that third attendance poll. I think Andrew leaves them up for about a minute. Associational disability discrimination simply says that it is actually a form of disability discrimination if I need time off because my parent, spouse, child, or other immediate family member needs me to provide some kind of care, and therefore I need a form of accommodation. So we already know that's going to fall under CFRA, but even if they don't qualify for CFRA, they're still job protected under the associational disability discrimination categories. All right, FEHA disability, accommodation analysis, engage in the interactive process, document, determine if there's a reasonable accommodation, think outside the box. It's not just a leave of absence. It's not just doing exactly whatever it is the employee asks you to do. There's compromises, there's things in between. Undue hardship, tough to prove. If you're going to deny reasonable accommodation based on undue hardship, be ready to prove it. All right, so in summary, for all health-related leaves, I want you to get that medical certification. I want you to note the expiration date. I want you to engage in the interactive process and reasonably accommodate, except when you can't, because CFRA you can't, pregnancy disability leave you can't. I want you to provide the written notices that tell them what to do. I want your good written policies to spell it all out. I don't want you to fire somebody without seeking legal counsel. If you even have a hint that there's a question about what's right, what's wrong, what's required, what's not, talk to legal counsel before you get yourself into trouble. All right, do we have any questions on leaves of absence or reasonable accommodation? When you say 12 weeks for CFRA, is that considered 60 working days? It's whatever 12 weeks is for that person. So if that person works 3 days a week, then 12 weeks is 12 times 3. If that person works 1 day a week, then it's 12 times 1. It's 12 calendar weeks. Again, maybe intermittent, maybe interspersed, but it's not it's not calendar days. So if somebody works 3 days a week, you do not then have to give 60 days of leave. Good question. Oops, what did I do here? All right, we're going to move hopefully relatively quickly through the next few topics. Alternative dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration. What's the difference between them? So mediation is where an employee is bringing a claim. You want to try and settle a claim, and you want a third-party neutral person to help you do that. We bring in a mediator, employee sits in one room, or perhaps one Zoom area. Employer sits in one Zoom area, and the third-party mediator just goes back and forth between the two, trying to get you to come to a number that you will agree on that settles their claims in exchange for a release of all claims that says they can't sue you. If you don't reach agreement, then that's the end of the day and the dispute continues on. If you do reach agreement, everybody signs the agreements, everybody gets their whatever they get out of that agreement, and you're done with that dispute. That's mediation. There's no judge, there's no jury, there's no decision that's made that you don't have control over. You choose whether or not you're agreeing to whatever is determined. Arbitration, very different. I know the word sounds similar, but very different. Arbitration is basically the exact same thing as going to trial in court, except you have a private arbitrator that you and the other side has chosen. So arbitration is still a dispute. It's still a way of resolving a dispute outside of a courtroom and a jury and a random judge that is assigned to you, but it's the same basic process. So in our world, we have what we call mandatory arbitration agreements by which we can require that employee agree. I can't go to court. I can't get a jury. I can't get a random judge. I agree I'm going to go to arbitration, and we will choose a private judge who will determine our case. Why do you want that? Number one, plaintiffs' lawyers don't like arbitration. They want a jury. They want, I hate to say it this way because it sounds so jaded. That's what many years in this business gets you. They want their employee to be able to sit on the witness stand and sob and cry and woe is me, and for the jury to feel sorry for that person. They also may want, in some cases, that jury to be confused by the law. They also want the jury in some cases to say, well, yeah, I know that it looks like the employer probably met exactly what the law was, but I still didn't like the way they handle it, so I'm still going to give the employee some money. Arbitrators don't do that. Arbitrators are former judges, they're lawyers, they've been in the business for decades usually. They don't care about the witness crying. We're all cold-hearted. We don't care about whether the employer was mean. We care about the letter of the law, and do we think the employer followed the law or not? So plaintiffs' lawyers don't like arbitration. There's no jury, private arbitrator instead. Plaintiffs cannot appeal. Plaintiffs don't like the outcome. They don't get to go and say, oh, I'm going to appeal that and see if the Court of Appeal will reverse it. What are the downsides? There are very significant downsides. Number one, it's expensive, and you get to pay 100%. So if you're in court, you don't pay the judge. You're paying for your taxes, but you don't pay the judge. In private arbitration, you are paying that arbitrator for every minute that they spend on your case. And the private arbitrators generally cost somewhere between $700 and $1,000 per hour. So you're paying for all that time. Employee doesn't pay for any of it. One of the reasons we've liked arbitration agreements in recent years is because we can make sure that class action can't be sustained. We're allowed to do that within the context of an arbitration agreement, but it doesn't prevent pocket claims. I'm not going to get into all of that other than to say the class action reasons that we used to have kind of don't apply anymore. Another downside is you can't appeal either. Nobody can appeal. So if you think that the arbitrator got it wrong, you also cannot file appeal and ask the Court of Appeal to review it. So those are the upsides and the downsides of arbitration agreements. Maybe you want one, maybe you don't. If you're interested in that, we can certainly talk about it more. All right, different type of agreement, whole different context and scenario. Release agreements. An employee is leaving your employment. They've either quit, you're firing them, you're laying them off, their leave of absence has expired and they're not coming back. Any number of reasons why an employee is leaving your employment. You may want to have a release agreement in exchange for some amount of money that you pay them. So the amount of money you pay them is what we call consideration. Contracts require that you give consideration in exchange for some consideration back. So I'm giving you this payment, that's my consideration. You're giving me a release of all claims. That's your consideration. That's how we establish a release agreement in exchange for a payment. Now, you may have disputed claims, so you want to settle them. We get a release agreement in exchange for a settlement payment. You may have a situation where there's no real dispute, right? But you know that this employee might sue because that's just what she does. You know that this employee is really ticked off and you just don't want to deal with her going to the labor board. And even though you know that you've done nothing wrong, you don't want to deal with it. So for any number of reasons, you may want to offer some additional payment. It may not be a settlement payment, right? Because there's not a dispute, but some additional payment, your consideration, in exchange for a release, the employee's consideration. So particularly in the context of employment ending, you may want to think about, am I willing to offer some severance in exchange for a release agreement? Do I want a release agreement? Why would I offer it? Why would I not offer it? Well, you offer it because you're basically buying insurance. You're buying an insurance policy that says, I won't get sued by my employee. Good reason to do it. You also may want to do it simply because that employee's been with you for 25 years. You want to send them off with a severance package. If you're going to give a severance package, why not get a release agreement back in exchange? I have an employer right now who I'm dealing with who had an employee for 22 years. He sold his business. When the business sold, she was one of 2 people who were not retained. It's a dentist's office, and they just didn't need the people not retained were the office manager, which the new practice, it was being acquired by an already existing practice. The acquiring practice already had an office manager, so they didn't retain the office manager. They already had a ton of dental assistants, so they didn't keep this particular chairside assistant. This particular chairside assistant who'd been with the employer for 22 years, no disputes, no problems, was like family in all sorts of ways, filed a lawsuit against that employer because she's mad she didn't get severance. So a lot of reasons to consider offering severance. Why not? Well, because when you offer severance, it's sort of a red flag, right? You're sort of waving this red flag that says, I'm offering you severance, but I'm asking you for a release agreement instead. And that employee may think, what are they afraid of? Why do they want a release agreement? Maybe I should start Googling to see what I can sue them for. So that is one of the reasons to be concerned. And so if you're in that situation, we're certainly going to talk about why you want to offer it, why you not want to offer it, what's the best way to communicate it. Every situation is different, so we'll certainly consider it. How much do you offer, again, is going to vary depending on what the circumstances are and why you're offering it. If it's somebody who's been with you for 4 months and it's just not working out, maybe you offer 2 weeks. If it's somebody who's been with you for 15 years and now you're just having to do a layoff because COVID devastated your practice and you no longer need 5 hygienists, so you're having to lay people off, you may want to offer it to make sure that you don't get a claim. You may want to offer it as a way to say, thank you, I appreciate you. But in that situation, you're certainly going to be looking at how much, what's appropriate, given the context of what's happening. So it varies. Let's see, in release agreements, one of the things that we want to talk about is what kinds of provisions can you put into that release agreement. In years past, when it's a disputed matter or an employee who we really don't ever want to hire back, we would include what we called a no rehire provision. Last year, the California legislature gave us AB 749, which said you cannot put a no rehire provision in a settlement agreement. This came about as part of the Me Too movement and looking at females in particular who were being paid off based on sexual harassment. And then we're being told, and you also cannot apply to be rehired. So AB 749 kind of was born out of that context. It says you cannot have a no rehire provision unless you have a good faith reason to think that that person engaged in sexual harassment or sexual assault. So you can have it against the accused person who you think is guilty. You cannot have it against the victim or the accuser. So that's one reason why you can have it. Or if you have another legitimate, non-discriminatory, non-retaliatory reason. So, for example, in the context that I just gave of the employee who, after 22 years, was let go, let's say that the employer hadn't sold the practice and was still continuing on. She was a good employee. Let's say she's only being laid off because of COVID and we just didn't have enough work, but then she sued. You now cannot have a no rehire provision because it would be discriminatory. It would be retaliatory. There's no other legitimate reason for not rehiring that person. So it's one of the things that we think about in termination, in separation agreements. It's kind of a bummer that we can't have those, although we used to have those. All right, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so I will assume that we should continue on. All right, unemployment insurance. Should you oppose a former employee's application for unemployment insurance? That may sound like a silly question, but it's not, and here's why. I am a proponent. I'm in favor of letting employees have their unemployment insurance most of the time. Why? Well, if you oppose their application and you win, or you lose, you're probably really going to tick off a former employee. If that employee doesn't get their unemployment because of you, because you wouldn't let them have it, they're going to start Googling, how can I sue my employer? So let them have it. Does it cost you anything? Sure. If your contributions, when you do your payroll, your EDD contribution for unemployment is 3.5%, maybe it goes up to 3.9%. In my life, in my thinking, there's not enough reason to oppose somebody's application for unemployment. Let them have their employment. Don't create a fight, a dispute. So, why and when would you oppose their unemployment insurance application? Couple different reasons. Number one, because they put something on there like, my employer fired me when I complained about sexual harassment. Oh, no. We're opposing that one. That is not at all what happened. You want to oppose it for an employee who's claim against you. You've already gotten this letter threatening to sue you. Forget it. I'm not going to let you have your unemployment insurance, which looks like one, wrongfully terminated. I'm going to oppose it, and I'm going to try and win. Those are some reasons why and why not. Again, just automatically oppose it, automatically not oppose it. Think context, think about the reason, and decide whether or not you want to. So you fired an employee because they were a terrible worker. How could they possibly rule against you? 3 categories or 3 things that they want to initially determine in deciding not the employee qualifies for unemployment. So was it a quit or discharge? There are actually reasons why somebody might quit and still get unemployment. We'll talk about that towards the end. Was it a discharge? Let's assume yes. If it was a discharge for misconduct as defined in the Insurance Code. Now I want to be very clear. Misconduct is defined in the Unemployment Insurance Code very differently than it is defined or than it is in any other context. So in a minute I'm going to talk about what is misconduct under the UI code. I do not want you to mistake that for wrongful. That is not at all what it means. It just means it gets unemployment. And the last thing that they always look at is what was the last incident, trigger event that caused you to fire this right at this time. Sometimes when you're calling, I want to terminate this employee, here's why. One of the questions I'm going to do is, why now? What's the trigger event? What just happened that's causing you to fire that employee right now? I'm asking you in part for unemployment, but partly because it's wise analysis, even if we're having to defend a lawsuit as to why you fired that employee right then when you did. To establish misconduct, ED is going to look at 4 different factors of it. Number 1, violate material duty. Material meaning an important duty. Minor little thing. I put 3 pens in my purse and took them home with me. That's not going to be a material duty. Substantial the duty, so they substantially breached it, not just a little. Was it on purpose, or was it because they're being reckless, careless, wanton? They could have prevented themselves from violating that duty. And did it actually cause you some little injury? All right, so what types of actions? Let's kind of do a little bit of analysis here. So again, intentional violation of a significant rule. It is my rule that everybody must arrive for work on time. Significant rule because I have patients. And when those patients are here, they need to be seen right away. We need to already be up and running, have the operatories ready to go, the charts up. We need to have had our morning huddle so that everybody knows what's going on. So everybody has to be here on time. That is a significant duty that matters to you. What types of actions constitute misconduct? Gross negligence. So in addition to intentional violation, if it is a grossly negligent violation, so it is required that you dare not to destroy it, right? And only dropped it, the gross negligence. But on the other hand, I threw it across the room to the dentist and thought he did and he didn't. That's going to be grossly negligent. You do not throw equipment across the room. So I didn't intentionally break it, but it broke because I was grossly negligent. Or some action or failure to take an action new or any reasonable known would result in a discharge. So those are the kinds of things that constitute misconduct. Intentional violations, grossly negligent conduct, action that I basically knew if I do this, I'm going to get fired for it. It does not constitute misconduct under the UI code. Regular negligence, I keep making mistakes, I keep having errors, I keep not scheduling insurance right, I keep making mistakes. That's considered regular negligence or just will get the employment. It's still a very good reason to terminate it. Will get unemployment insurance benefits because the concept is they did intentionally, they taking an action grossly negligently, knew or should have known would result in their employment. They just couldn't do the job, just the skill, ability. They were careless, they were just thoughtless, not reckless, not wanton disregard. Inefficient, slow, I'm just not very good at my job. They'll get unemployment. It's not wrongful termination, but they're going to get unemployment. Poor performance, violations without good, clear warnings before discharge. January, we nauseam, you to document, give warnings before discharge. This is one of those reasons. If an employee says, because of tardiness, and you decide not that, give her so many chances, it was ridiculous, and she deserved that, and I'm going to oppose it. If you just oppose by sending something in writing saying, yep, she was absent a lot, and the last time I finally had enough, but you do not have any documentation behind that where she was warned and she was warned exactly what's going to happen. This is what the history is. She's going to get her unemployment because he wants to know that she knew if she continued to take that action or in showing up to work on time would be fired. The EDD wants to see that person made that choice. They caused themselves to be fired. Errors, including errors in judgment, they're probably going to get their unemployment. So the concept here is that if I'm taking action that I basically have control of, I can control when I'm showing up to work. I can control whether I'm doing my job right or wrong. I can control whether or not I'm making a lot of mistakes. And despite knowing that I can control that, I still engage in that conduct. I still keep showing up late. That is what the EDD wants to see, to say, you don't get unemployment because it's your own fault. Your fault you're unemployed, and you had options for not being unemployed. You had options for keeping your job, and you did not exercise those options. The general concept here. All right, so violation of practice rule. The conduct is the rule. Did the employee know about the rule? Were there previous warnings? Did they willfully or deliberately violate the rule? Were your interests substantially affected? A material violation? Those are the kind of looking for to determine, is it misconduct under the. So, example, absence and tardiness. Employee's late arrival after warning. So, he's on a warning, final warning, if you continue to be fired, and the employee is driving to work and there's an accident and they've stopped trying to land a medevac helicopter that's completely out of their control, that is good cause. If you fire the employee because, well, it doesn't matter why, I told you one more absence, one more late, and you're going to be fired, that employee will get unemployment insurance. Failure to follow required policy procedures, such as notifying the employer as instructed. So you keep being late, you keep not calling us to tell us you're going to be late. So it's not even just the lateness, it's the violation of the policy. You know the policy, you have the option of complying with the policy, you refuse to comply with the policy. Now you're not just being fired for the tardiness, you're being fired also for violating the policy. Were there clear specific warnings before termination? Again, what types of situations in absence and tardiness do not constitute misconduct? There truly was nothing to do about being on time. The employee's previously been, but you have not established good with respect to what is expected. You kind of let it go. The employee knew I was mad, but I didn't write them up. All right. Again, we're going to talk about that. What was the final reason that caused you to now make the decision to fire that employee? So last absence, is there a good, is there, or last tardiness also, is there a reason? If so, that's not going to be a great trigger reason. But provide notice to the employer. So maybe there's a good reason for the absence, but they still call like I told them to. I made it clear in the handbook. I made a warning that I gave them that they have to call me. They cannot text message me. They cannot just call a coworker. They must call me, and they did not do that. So now the trigger reason isn't last absence for which there was good reason. It is their failure to follow the policy and call me, unless there's a good reason they didn't. I was in the hospital, right? So those are the kinds of things that go on. It gets into the weeds. But if you care about unemployment insurance and you want to oppose it, factors we're going to look at. If you get a call, we'll talk through tonight. Are you probably going to win or are you probably going to lose? That may also inform your decision as to whether or not you should bother to oppose it. Voluntary quit. Somebody may qualify for unemployment even though they voluntarily quit if there's a real substantial and compelling reason, and any reasonable person would have quit for those reasons. Mostly what we see here is my employer was so abused, yelled at me, screamed at me, slammed the door, called me a name, treats everybody. I couldn't, even though that employee quit, they're going to get unemployment. All right. You opposed and you lost, or you won and the employee lost. Somebody's going to appeal. The losing end, should you file an appeal, we're going to do that analysis. And chance of winning if you file the appeal. Can we set you up for, or are you probably going? How the system works is when you get that unemployment notice, read that notice. It tells you what it tells you. They have something like 10 days to notice of appeal. If you don't meet it within the time, there's a chance that it will be denied unless you can file it. If good, we're going to prepare for the hearing. Help you, just engage me to help you prepare, depending on what the reasons are, depending on the whole context. If it's suing, it may be very important to us that we did at that hearing. It may be worth your investment. Have me come, or another lawyer come to you and make sure that we do everything we can to make sure you win, because it has other consequences that matter to us. Otherwise, we'll walk you through. It's important. Here's how you should prepare here's how you should present your case. Here's the witnesses you should have come with you, because even if you provide their written declarations, it's almost meaningless, but them being present to provide testimony is very impactful. Decision will come a month or so later, and then we move on. All right, circling back to the first question after all of this, when you get that very first application, again, think about, should you or should you not oppose it? Why? Think about what the consequences are, good, bad, or otherwise. Think about what your motivations are, good, bad, or otherwise. Decide if we should have a conversation about it. All right, my last topic, and then we'll take any remaining questions. EPLI, Employer Practices Liability Insurance. When you get a dispute, you get a claim from the Labor Board, you get a claim from PH, which is the department that enforces the FEHA that we've had all along. It's a department that of the CFRA. It enforces the pregnancy leave. You may get notices from them. You may just get a loss. You get an attorney demand letter. If you don't pay us billions of dollars, we're going to sue you. If you have received any of those kinds of things, one of the first things we want to do is look at, do you have EPLI, Employer Practices Liability Insurance? If you do, then your decision, do you want to tender that claim? If you do, there are time requirements. You need to tender them later. And each policy has rules about when that is, but we want to immediately determine if we tend to make sure we do it in a timely manner. Should we have it? So Employer Practices Liability Insurance basically covers almost every kind of claim except wage and hour. So there's almost everything about today, everything we talked about in January. It covers almost nothing that we talked about in February, because the concept is, if you do not pay your employees their wages, we're not going to provide insurance for that. You should have paid your employees' wages. We're not paying for you insurance. So it covers discrimination, harassment, retaliation, wrongful termination, defamation, failure to provide accommodation, disability discrimination, It covers kinds of things. Should you have it, you just have to do that analysis. Am I willing to spend the money to know that insurance covers in case I get one claims? How does it works differently depending on which insurance company you choose. TC has a very different policy than most companies. TDIC used to have one policy. It was $100,000. That applied to paying your attorney's fees. It applied to settling the case. It applied to a judgment at the end of the case. It applied to everything related to this. We recently had a case where there's TDIC coverage, and it's only providing $50,000 of coverage. And I haven't had the time to call TDIC to say, explain to me what's going on. I have different options of policies. I don't know, but if TDIC insurance is how their insurance works. Other policies are different, more like a traditional insurance. You have a deductible, you have a cap on how much coverage there is. You may choose how much that determines what your monthly premiums. You choose, I'm willing to pay more to have more deductible, all those sorts of things. Things that happens a lot with my dental practices. We get a dispute. I ask the question, do you have APLI? And their answer is, yeah, I think so. I have every insurance. If you do not definitely know you have EPLI, then you probably don't have EPLI. You went to TDIC and they gave you a bunch of stuff. If you did not say, hey, I also want EPLI, there's a decent chance they did not give it to you. So if you know EPLI, call TDIC if you have their insurance. Otherwise, I say, do I already have EPLI? If I don't, what's covered? How much is it? Make that decision. You may then want to compare it with some other insurance company. You carry EPLI? How much does it cost? What are the options? Compare your options, decide what you want to do. But don't go on thinking, I have every kind of insurance, I must have EPLI, because you may find out that you don't when the time comes that you need it. Okay. Wrapping up with the way I always wrap up, and I hope that today has really reinforced. I want you to have a good employee handbook for all sorts of reasons, including all the reasons that I've talked about today, including all the reasons in January and February. Get it from me or you get it somebody else. Have a good, current, compliant employee handbook. Don't just steal it from somebody else. Don't borrow it. Don't get it from your friend. You have no idea whether or not it's legal, current, compliant. You have no idea whether or not it is going to actually fit the needs for your practice. So I do them. I encourage you to call me. If not me, call some other employment lawyer. Oh, my voice knows that I should be wrapping up the program. All right, in your last 3 pages are employee handbook service that we offer. Reminder that harassment prevention training is mandatory, and we sell books that are almost done, being updated for 2021 if you have those. All right. Wrapping up our 2021 series, we have the last attendance poll. If you have are still on the line and you have been not looking at the screen, jump up, look at the screen, take a look at that attendance poll, mark yes or no, get your CE credits. I'm going to jump on the Q&A to see if this is a question that I should answer. Is there a statute of limitations where a former employee has a limited time to file a claim against the employer? Absolutely. There are many statutes of limitation. Let me throw some out to you. For a lot of what we've been talking about today, any cause of action that falls under the FEHA, the Fair Employment Housing Act, the employee actually has an obligation under the law to do what's called exhaust their administrative remedies. What that means is that before they can file a lawsuit against you, they actually have to file a claim with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Now, they can file that claim and they can request that the FEHA close that claim on the very same day. And if they do that, that probably means they already have a lawyer. Statute of limitation, the employee has 3 years to do that from the time of the last violation. Once they've done that, and they get what's called a right to sue notice, they get the please open and close my case, give me my right to sue notice, then they have 1 year to file a lawsuit in court. So for these kinds of violations or claims, whether or not there's a violation, you might get a claim, about most things we've been talking about today, 3 years to exhaust their administrative remedies, 1 year to then file a lawsuit. For many other things, there are different statutes of limitation. For most of our wage and hour stuff, there's a 3-year statute of limitation if they're filing with the labor board. If they're going to file a lawsuit, there's a different claim they can throw in that gives them a 4th year, which attorneys always throw in. Assume it's a 4-year statute of limitation on wage and hour kinds of things. Wrongful termination based on what we call public policy. So it's not based on the statute, it's based on the public policy. 2-year statute of limitation. I think those are primarily limitations that are paid. Can we ask for medical certification after the employee has started their leave? Absolutely. I have a PDL and CFR situation. I haven't. Yeah, absolutely. And don't hesitate. And what I would probably do is just say, hey, you've been out on leave of absence for X period of time. I see that we have not gotten a medical certification form. By the way, if you email me and ask me for the healthcare provider certification, I'll send it to you. So then you will send this to the employee, say, please have your healthcare provider fill this out. You're allowed to require that they do that within 15 days. Put that in there. Please return it to me within 15 days. You should provide a job description with that healthcare provider certification, because that's what tells the healthcare provider, can the employee do their job? If you don't have a job description, there's a place on the form where you write in what their duties are. So yes, you can do that. You should do that. Even though you didn't do it at the very beginning, absolutely do it now, no question. All right, no more questions. Going once, going twice. I think we're going to call it. All right. Thank you all so much for attending this year's Employment Law 101, 102, 103 series. We'll probably be back in 2022 with new fun stuff. You know how to reach me. My email address is on the cover of the handout. You can always email Andrew. He'll be happy to let you know my contact information. I love doing these programs. I'm so sorry we're not in person, but glad that we could get together at least via webinar. Thank you all for attending. Enjoy your Friday and good luck.
Folks, if you're still with us, in the chat section, there will be 2 links. One is for Employment Law 101. If you didn't see it, you can view it on demand. The other is for Employment Law 102. Also, CE certificates will be emailed out in about 2 weeks. If you don't receive them after 2 weeks, please email me. And this afternoon, all attendees will receive an email containing a brief survey for the webinar. If you receive the survey, or when you receive the survey, please fill it out. I read each and every one of these, and I use them to make the webinars better and better. Anita, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone else, thank you so much for being with us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.